Michelle's scream cut through the heads turned. The choir faltered mid-phrase. The priest's voice stopped in the middle of a blessing and hung there, thin and useless. A dozen cameras swung toward the small girl in red, and for a moment, every measured, morning breath in the garden stopped. She stood between rows of black suits and prim hats, a bright pinprick of color that every eye refused to ignore. Her dress was wrong for the occasion, the shade of a summer dress, not the damp day that had gathered around Miller Brendan's white casket, but she had refused to change. She could not let the day pass without a truth spoken. Her hand shook where she held the object that had given her courage, a silver pocket watch, its face open and rimmed with a faint smear of blue. Mila, the widow, turned. For the first time that day something unsteady flashed across her carefully composed face. Her breath hitched. A practiced tear slid too late. Felicity, who had watched more grief and more performance than most, felt the crack in Mila's mask before the rest of them did. She rose on aching knees, gripping her cane as if it were an anchor, and said 3 words with a voice that did not allow argument. Let the child speak. Michelle swallowed. Her legs trembled, so hard she thought she might fall. The world around her blurred into a chorus of shocked whispers. What is she saying? A child accusing the widow, while somewhere distant the rain began again, a soft percussion on the tented canopy. She raised the pocket watch until the sun caught it, and the blue fleck twinkled like a tiny wound. Miller's initials glinted on the back. She had found it the night she saw Mila bend over his tea, when the house was dark and the mansion's sleep-breathing and secrets seemed louder than any piano. That night felt as close now as the breath in her throat. She could hear it like a recording. The house settling, the quiet tick of the grandfather clock, Miller's soft snores through the corridor. She had wandered downstairs, thirsty, driven by a nightmare that still tasted like metal. There had been a faint light in the study, and the hush of someone moving too carefully. She had paused at the top of the stairs and peered over the banister. Mila was there, fingers trembling, uncorking a tiny blue vial the size of her thumb. Her silhouette was flawless in the lamplight. The silk robe, the hair pinned back, the worldliness of someone who wore wealth like a second skin. She leaned over Miller's cup and tipped a single drop into the steaming tea. She muttered into the phone at the same time, voice low and urgent. Michelle remembered the words because they had sounded like a prize being counted. He won't make it through the week. Be ready to move the accounts the minute he slips. The sentence had landed in Michelle's chest like an accusation that belonged to someone else. The tiny vial slipped from Mila's fingers and struck the hearth. Glass tinked. Miller's heavy watch clattered to the floor. Michelle had moved before she knew she could. She had tucked the watch into her palm and drawn back into shadow, watching the way Mila's eyes cut toward the staircase, and then, cold as winter, toward the spot where a child's silhouette might stand. Mila's mouth shaped words Michelle would never forget. Go back to bed, she hissed as if she had the power to hush memory itself. Forget whatever you think you saw. Michelle did not forget. Miller fell ill 3 days later. Fever like fire. Sweats that soaked his collar. He blamed indigestion at first, as if he could dress the stab of poison with gentleness and the truth would look dignified. Mila had remained a pillar of patient sorrow, keeping caretakers at bay, scheduling tests, waving away nurses that asked the wrong questions. Miller's decline was measured, his death official, his estate preparations sensible and quick. Now, standing under the funeral tent, Michelle felt the old fear and the new anger collide inside her until she could no longer remain silent. Mila poisoned him, she said, voice tiny but jagged. She put something in his tea. I saw her. A ripple of noise went through the mourners. Cameras swiveled. A woman clutched her pearls like she might faint. An editor in a suit whispered to a colleague. Detective Kareem, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd in plain clothes, moved closer, his face a professional mask that barely concealed curiosity. He had not expected a witness at a funeral, and certainly not a child. Michelle's hand opened to show the watch. The blue smear along the inner rim was faint but there, like a bruise. Kareem crouched, so his eyes were even with hers, gentle as if handling a wounded bird. How do you know that's poison? He asked. Because she said it, Michelle said. She told someone on the phone he would be dead in a week. She said half of everything goes to them after he dies. The words tasted like the secret, and the secret tasted like ash. She said, "Finish the job. Mila esse composure absurd." Her voice slithered between fury and panic as she tried to regain control of the scene. This is preposterous," she cried. "This child is confused." Her hands, which had been so steady all morning, trembled now. She pushed past rows of chairs, heels digging in the grass as if in flight. 2 men from the estate's security took hold of her, voices sharp as they tried to keep her from running. For one all too brief second, she looked not like a widow, but like a trapped animal. Felicity stepped forward and planted herself between the commotion and the casket. Her voice was small but iron. "You will not lay a hand on her." She steadied Michelle with an arm that had held many things: children, lovers, losses, and now steadied a child who had stood louder than any orator. The elderly woman's eyes were wet but resolute. Miller had been her brother's friend. He had been a man who liked children and told bad jokes and left socks somewhere in his study. He had been someone who noticed Michelle's stubborn laugh and had once pressed a coin into her palm and said, "Keep mischief to a minimum." The security guards cuffed Mila anyway, not because the crowd demanded it, but because the scene had tilted into a different gravity where accusation required action. She lashed out with words, calling Michelle names and promising ruin. Her voice broke on the last syllable, as if the act of speaking the crime aloud made it more real to her than to anyone else. Michelle flinched, but she did not step back. She turned to Felicity and whispered, "She's not the only one." The words were small, a warning and a promise. Felicity's face changed, the line at her mouth deepening. "Who else?" she asked. Michelle's mind went back to the sound of the phone that night, to the man's voice, low, rough, clever enough to hide greed behind reason. "He said us," she whispered. "Not me. Someone else. He said they were going to finish the job." Detective Kareem listened without expression, the gears of investigation already turning in the lines around his eyes. Outside the tent, the photographer's shutters clicked like the ticking of some terrible clock. The garden smelled faintly of wet earth and lilies and something else Michelle could not name, fear. The last thing Michelle saw before the police officers led Mila away was Felicity's hand, warm and steady on her shoulder. The older woman leaned close and murmured, "You were brave. Hold on to that." Michelle gripped the pocket watch as if it were a talisman and as if the blue smear on its rim were a map that might show her the way to the truth. She had spoken. For the first time, the house that had sheltered her nightmares had been open to daylight, and she felt a tremor of relief under her fear. The funeral, which had been meant to end a life, had instead become where a life's worst secret began to unravel. Detective Kareem did not like surprises. In his 20 years on the force, funerals had been the kind of places where people cried and eulogies were written from rehearsed memory. They were not the scenes of confessions, and certainly not the arenas for 6-year-olds to accuse widows of murder. Yet here he was, crouched on the damp grass, watching a child hold a bruised silver watch like evidence and listening to a pocket-sized indictment delivered in a voice too small for the room. He led Michelle gently away from the crowd toward the little drawing room that sat off the marquee, a place where the catering staff left untouched trays and condolence cards. The room smelled faintly of lemon and old paper. Kareem sat on the edge of an orchid-patterned sofa and made his questions soft because he knew how fragile witnesses like Michelle could be. He had handled hardened criminals and terrified victims, and he had learned that the difference between getting the truth and losing it forever was often the tone of a single sentence. "Tell me again what you saw," he said. Michelle's fingers were tucked into the hem of her dress. She repeated the night as if reading from a script engraved in bone. She described the lamplight, the silk of Mila's robe, the way the little blue vial flashed when it hit the hearth. Kareem asked about the phone call. Michelle's eyes fluttered. She listened for the voice in her memory before she spoke the exact words. "He won't make it through the week. Be ready to move the accounts the minute he slips. Finish the job." Kareem felt the hairs on his arms prick. He had heard 100 corrupt whispers in his career, but the phrase "finish the job" carried a cruelty that did not belong to a casual lover's quarrel or a business misunderstanding. It suggested planning, dismissal, and a partnership between people willing to kill for gain. He took notes, not because he trusted a child's memory more than forensic evidence, but because a child's memory is sometimes the first slender thread that pulls a spider's web of corruption apart. Word moved fast. Within hours, a digital voice print analyst had combed through recorded calls from numbers associated with Miller Brendan's accounts. A name kept surfacing in the shadows of the data: Gordon Hale. Gordon was not a household name like Miller Brendan. He kept his face and his activities behind legal entities and numbered accounts. Where Miller built hospitals and liberally signed charity checks, Gordon managed money in the kind of corners the press rarely lit. He was Miller's financial partner, the man who wore a suit like armor and smiled without showing teeth. The police ringed the perimeter of the estate that night with the discretion of men who knew the optics. Detectives in plain clothes spoke to the estate manager, examined Miller's last days, and watched footage from security cameras that suddenly seemed too sparse for the $10 million house. The footage showed a shadowed figure with a limp gait near the service entrance 3 nights before Miller's collapse. That same night, private jets logged an unusual departure from a nearby runway. A safe house an associate used burned to the ground in the early hours of morning. Bank accounts in Gordon's name displayed the sort of activity that made auditors frown. Rapid transfers offshore, shell corporations activated, money vanished as if by careful sleight of hand. Mila, cuffed and furious at the funeral, sat in an interrogation room in the precinct that had the harsh glow of fluorescent light. She was dressed now in a hospital-grade jumpsuit and looked smaller than she had that morning under the canopy. Detectives attempted to exploit the cracks in her composure, but she held tight. She would not tell them everything. She would not tell them the arrangements she had made or the names of the men she had spoken to, but she did not pretend ignorance of the fact that someone had orchestrated the crime beyond her own hands. When interrogators mentioned Gordon's name, Mila's lips parted for the briefest moment, and a look crossed her face that needed no translation: fear. She began to mutter, to break at the edges, then shut down entirely, as if a memory contained a live wire that would singe her if she brushed it. Felicity watched all of this with a careful, guarded attention. The funeral had pushed her into a new orbit. Miller's absence was a cold fact that felt like an old friend's empty chair. She had known the man in a way reporters never would. He had a bad sweet tooth and an embarrassing collection of novelty ties. He had been the sort of bachelor who liked board games and children's jokes. He had been generous and careless with his safes. Felicity was not a woman to be coddled. She had survived war years and betrayals, and she had raised people who were better than the world sometimes allowed. Now she found herself both furious and protective. When social services arrived to ask questions about Michelle, protocol in the wake of such media frenzy, they found not an unsettled orphan but a steady hand. Felicity offered temporary guardianship. She signed forms with a small, deliberate hand. She had always been clear-eyed about what Miller's wealth had created and what it had attracted. She also knew something of legal red tape, and had called a lawyer she trusted before the sun had set on the day of the funeral. The authorities approved the arrangement with relief. It was better for a child to remain within the home she knew than to be shuffled through the mechanical kindness of placements. Felicity prepared simple rooms, smoke detectors checked, and routes mapped. She taught Michelle how to call a number and how to whisper when the telephone line was listened to. Her protection was practical and calm in a world that had become anything but. While the police followed financial trails and subpoenaed emails, Felicity took a different tack. She spent afternoons in Miller's study, a room the public had always imagined full of ledgers and austere decisions. She methodically went through books, drawers, the false bottom of a desk that Miller, in his absent-minded way, had once shown her for a laugh. She found a folder under a stack of old annual reports, plain manila, edges worn. Inside were documents that made her stomach do a slow fall. Transfer requests bearing Miller's signature but signed in a hand that trembled, memos hinting at the activation of dormant trusts, a series of bank drafts moving to numbered companies overseas. There was a note, too, a single line in Miller's handwriting that read, "Protect Michelle." No explanation, only the command and the careful penmanship of a man who feared what he could not control. The papers were not explosive on their face. They suggested plausibility and motive, the kind of practical arrangements financial predators use to braid legality and theft. Felicity photocopied everything, left originals where she found them, and sent copies to Detective Kareem through a secure channel. Her life had been steeped in discretion, and she understood the need for a procedural path to justice as much as she felt the raw urge to confront the people who had taken a man from them. Rumors began to circle. Journalists started asking questions about Gordon Hale's connections. Friends of Miller offered testimony that whispered of a man with a grin too quick to be honest. The estate's security logs revealed gaps around the times of suspicious activity. Police analysts, following paper trails and phone metadata, agreed that Gordon had been careful. Very careful. A care that required resources and contingency plans. It meant he had already arranged ways to be gone. He had a network and the means to disappear. As evening closed 1 week after the funeral, the house seemed to fold around the 2 women inside it. Michelle practiced a lullaby with a voice she made intentionally brittle to keep her from dissolving into sleep. Felicity sat in Miller's favorite chair, the same one that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and lemon polish. The lamplight painted the study's book spines in gold. Outside, the hedges murmured in the wind. That night, as Felicity checked the locks and listened to the house breathe, the porch light flickered once, twice, and then burned steadily. She paused and lifted her head, listening for the city as if it might offer counsel. On the far edge of the property, where the garden met shadow, there was a shape that might have been a tree or a man. In the dimness it was hard to distinguish. Felicity did not speak it aloud. She simply rose and went to the window, one hand shading her eyes, and watched the silhouette with a patience that had been honed by long years into a dangerous kind of stillness. She whispered without surprise, just a measured acceptance of what must still be faced. He is not done. Night folded over the estate like a heavy curtain. The house exhaled quietly, each room settling into the practiced silence of a place that had weathered generations. Inside, Felicity sat by the fire with a mug of tea gone cold, watching Michelle trace the pattern on an old quilt. The child hummed a lullaby she had learned from Miller, a tune that always found the softest place in her throat. For a few hours, the world outside had seemed to forget the violence it had been promised. At 10:30, the lights dipped. At first it was a blink, a nuisance to be laughed off as an electrical hiccup. Then the lamp stayed stubbornly dark. The emergency glow from the hall cast grotesque shadows along the wallpaper. Michelle froze mid-note, eyes wide. Felicity rose, joints protesting, and moved to the window. The night looked ordinary, trees standing like a silent audience, but the circuit breaker panel, checked that afternoon, offered no easy answer. The house had been cut out of its ordinary life. She went to the vestibule and tested the doors. Bolts engaged, locks clicked, until she tried the back door and found it warmed by the scent of someone's passing. The electronic lock had been overridden, its small green light black. On the far edge of the garden, a shape moved, deliberate and slow, the silhouette of a man under a lamp flare. Felicity felt the familiar old muscle in her jaw tighten. She took Michelle's hand and whispered, "Stay close and be very quiet." They moved through the house with the soft precision of people who had practiced caution for years. Felicity led the child down a corridor lined with family portraits, the faces caught in paint looking down as if in judgment. The panic room door stood as it always did, a heavy metal slab behind a discreet bookshelf. Felicity had reinforced it with more than just code. She had added a second mechanical lock that required 2 hands and a steady pulse to open. She pushed Michelle inside and slammed the door. The steel thudded like a drum. "Stay behind the couch," she said, voice calm and practiced. "Don't make a sound. If I call, answer me with the word safe." Michelle's small face screwed up in confusion and fear, but she nodded and clambered behind the heavy furniture. Felicity set the emergency latch and felt the old thrill of control. She wanted to stay with the child, to be the shield between innocence and whatever darkness had come for them, but the house demanded more than shelter. She had to buy time, and sometimes buying time meant drawing fire. Footsteps were in the hall before Felicity could reach for the landline. They were slow and certain, not the hurried stomp of a marauder but the confident stride of someone who knew the house's bones. The back door smashed inward with the thunder of a boot. A man stepped through, framed in the blown night. He wore simple clothes that did not speak of wealth but of a practiced utilitarianism. In his hand, he carried a gun that caught the moonlight like a cold star. "Felicity," he said, voice like gravel. He did not bother with theatrics or threats. "You should have kept that child quiet." She saw him fully then. Gordon Hale, taller than his photos, older around the eyes. The careful man from the ledgers and offshore accounts, the shadow who had slipped through the city's legal seams. He smiled without light behind it and held the weapon not like a hunter, but like a man who had rehearsed decisions until they felt like truth. Felicity did not answer. She dragged a heavy dresser in front of the study door and shoved until her shoulders burned. Gordon laughed, a sound with no humor. He kicked the wood and it shuddered. His footsteps came closer. He had friends. The sound of other boots moving through the kitchen, the clink of metallic pouches. Someone was setting something down that gave off the telltale metallic scent of explosives. A smell personal and small, chemical and sure. Michelle pounded on the metal from across the room. Felicity heard the first sharp pop. The panic room door shivered. She pressed her back against the reinforcement and dug her fingers into the seam, as if she could hold steel with hope. "Michelle," she mouthed, though the child could not see her. "Remember the word." The detonator hummed. Then, with the force of an angry god, the door blew inward. The world became a cascade of glass and dust, and a sound like the sea crushing hard against rocks. For a heartbeat, Felicity thought her skull would split with the pressure. The bookshelves crashed into the room, splinters flying. The metal door folded like tin. Through the gas and smoke, Gordon's silhouette loomed, framed by the night beyond. "Get her!" he commanded. His men moved like shadows, measuring for grabs and quick hands. Felicity lunged, warm pain tearing across her side as a heavy object or a fist struck her down. She tasted iron and thought of old battles, lessons that had once been literal, and now were memory iron sharpened into resolve. She felt fingers on Michelle's shoulder, small and warm, the child trying to fight back. Gordon's hand closed on Michelle as if she were a thing, not a person. He lifted her like a prize. "Don't you squawk," he whispered to the child, and in his whisper was the calculation of men who had made murder into a business transaction. Somewhere in the distance, a siren sang faintly, a thread of red and blue. Felicity tried to rise, but the room tilted and her hearing fanned into a high, thin ring. She remembered the small pocket watch clasped in Michelle's hand when the girl had stood at the funeral. She remembered the look in Miller's eyes before the fever, the man who had once taught Michelle how to whistle with 2 fingers. That memory burned into her like fuel. Gordon's men ransacked the study with cold efficiency, ransacking drawers and scattering papers across the floor as if answers might hide in the space between family photographs. They tied Felicity's hands with rough rope and shoved a gag into her mouth. She bit down until her jaw ached, flat and non-compliant for someone who had been given no choice. Michelle's small body was held tight. Tears slicked her cheeks, but they did not fall fast enough to bed the terror. Gordon turned the child to face him and smiled as if to an old debt collector. "You picked the wrong family," he said, almost tenderly. "You picked the wrong time." His voice carried beyond the study, into the kitchen, into hallways. It carried like a broadcast. In the garden, Detective Kareem and his team, who had increased the estate perimeter when rumors of Gordon's network began to breathe in public, heard the shift in frequency. A gunshot, the crack of forced entry, the dull thud of heavy footsteps in the house. Men in dark clothing moved like a well-oiled machine. Kareem radioed. Lights on SUVs flashed like beetles. He did not approach the front. He did not enter with charity. He waited as trained for the right breach position and the cover the situation required. A rushed entry could cost lives. Gordon heard the sirens and the tightening net of law enforcement. He began to laugh, a loose sound in a narrow man. He kissed Michelle's forehead the way a man might sign a paper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, plastic and cruel, a remote triggering switch. "You set a good trap," he told Felicity, voice a mock compliment. "But traps are for animals." He raised the device and set it on the table where the children's pictures scattered. Felicity's heart lodged itself in her throat. She thought of Miller's watch, of the blue smear and the nights when a quiet house only seemed safe. She thought of a child's small hand. She thought of justice, bureaucratic and slow, and the price it often demanded. Michelle's hush was not for long. From the vents and the slats of the rafters came a scraping noise, the small, determined sound of someone who refuses to die to fear. She had crawled into the ducts as the explosion had ripped through the door, her knees raw, her breath ragged, and dropped into the kitchen like a shadow that might be either salvation or ruin. She grabbed the emergency handset, thumbs fumbling as her fingers shook. Her voice was a whisper threaded with courage and the thinness of a child's terror. 911, she said into the receiver, then the rest in a rush. She did what she had been taught. Speak slowly. Say your name. Tell them where you are. Her words were precise, the calendar of the house, and the address like a map laid between teeth. Gordon's head snapped toward the sound. In his hand, the remote trembled. He barked orders, a pack responding. Someone bolted toward the kitchen, boots hammering on tile. Michelle ran. Bare feet slapped cold stone as she darted for the stairs. Smoke curled, making the world taste like singed paper. She moved the way small people often do in stories of flight. Fast, nimble, making decisions with the narrow focus of those who believe there is nothing between them and air but speed. The steps blurred. She slapped her palm on the balustrade to steady herself, then pushed through the roof light and onto the cold rooftop where the wind cut like a knife and stars were indifferent. Gordon followed. He was behind her breath by breath. He raised the gun. Stop, he snarled. Stop and I will. Below the house, lights blossomed like false dawn. Detective Kareem's team unfolded in practice choreography, rifles slung and commands sparking through radios. Kareem's voice bellowed up to the roof, in the no-man's zone between vengeance and law. Drop the weapon. Drop the weapon now. Gordon's shape blanched for a second, the calculation flickering. The rooftop was a narrow crucible. Felicity, bleeding and bound, had managed somehow to stagger out through the kitchen as the men had searched for Michelle, and now limped to the roof with a stubbornness that was the marrow of her life. She had found a broken candlestick and held it like a reed. Gordon turned, momentarily distracted. In that split breath, Felicity lunged with the rawness of an age that had not learned to be polite to death. The candlestick struck the side of his head with a hollow punch. He faltered, lost balance, and slipped on the gravel. He reached, fingers grasping for air and nothing but sky. Men below shouted. Kareem's officers closed in. Gordon hit the rooftop, and then the ledge, and then the arms of men sworn to keep order. The gun clattered away. Michelle sank against Felicity's legs, shaking, tears and the salt of adrenaline braided together. The sirens were close now, red and blue painting the night in urgent strokes. Felicity's hands trembled as she undid the rope binding herself, older muscles aching with relief and the fierce joy of having kept a child alive. Gordon's eyes were open and clear for a brief moment, reading the faces that would book him for a lifetime. He had misjudged the measuring of human hearts, or perhaps he had simply believed that numbers always outlived courage. When the handcuffs clicked, Detective Kareem gave a short, almost private nod to Felicity and a broader, more public one to Michelle. The roof smelled of sweat and weak blood and the clean, final scent of control. The estate was bruised but whole enough to breathe again. Michelle sat with her knees pulled up, the pocket watch warm against her palm, the blue smear like a map to a future that would require more truth to be safe. Months folded into one another like pages turned with trembling fingers. The noise of the breaking story faded from the front pages and the pundits' mouths, but the courtrooms carried the weight of the truth forward in slow, deliberate increments. The trial was a corridor of small violences, witness boxes, soft legal breaths, the measured clack of lawyers' heels. Families watched in a paneled gallery as evidence was laid like a map, as recordings and bank transfers were explained to jurors who had not slept for the spectacle. Michelle sat beside Felicity most days, a small person in a large chair, fingers curled around the silver pocket watch that had started all of it. Felicity wore a plain suit and a face that had stopped being surprised by cruelty and started being methodical in its response. The prosecution painted a picture that made the jury's eyes narrow, a plan, not an accident, a partnership, not a quarrel, greed braided into a methodical stripping of a man who had trusted the wrong people. Forensic testimony translated the blue smear into chemistry, phone logs stitched voices into context, bank transfers materialized like a trail of footsteps leading away from Miller and toward numbered companies and accounts in jurisdictions that cared more for secrecy than conscience. Mila's confession never came in full. She clutched some parts of a story like splinters too painful to pull free. Gordon Hale, when cross-examined, unfolded into the book of his life. Calm, careful, and certain that his intellect was armor enough. When the jury returned, the verdicts were a sequence of strong syllables: guilt, conspiracy, first-degree murder. Sentences were heavy and precise, as if the legal language wanted to balance out the moral gravity of what had been done. Mila and Gordon received life terms. They were led away beneath a halo of flashbulbs and camera lenses that recorded their faces for decades. Felicity watched them go with eyes that had the flat honesty of someone who had witnessed too much to pretend at righteous triumph. Justice, she had learned, looked less like a clean victory and more like a slow, necessary settling. After the courtroom performances, after the press releases ceased to demand attention, the small work of living resumed. Felicity signed papers that made Michelle hers in a legal sense, a formal sealing of a bond that had already been forged in smoke and courage. The adoption was a quiet thing compared with the drama that had preceded it. A short hearing, a pro forma nod from a judge who had seen more children than anyone would like to imagine, the soft signatures that turned an arrangement into a permanence. Michelle clung to Felicity's hand when the judge said the word that made them family. The girl's face was at once relieved and bewildered, as if she had expected life to continue to be precarious even after the law had given it shape. Therapy arrived in small, steady doses. A woman named Dr. Adeyemi sat with Michelle in a room painted a neutral, calming blue, and taught the child how to name her fear and set it in a box she could open and close when it became too big. They practiced breathing exercises. They drew pictures of safe places. Miller's study rearranged as a garden, the pocket watch resting on a windowsill without meaning anything else. Felicity learned to let go in thin increments, to allow herself naps, and to order food that did not demand she cook it. She learned the language of paperwork, of trust funds being rerouted, of estate executors, finally bringing truth to ledger. She learned to sleep with the curtains half open and to make sure Michelle's bedroom door had a light on a low timer. On a damp morning that smelled faintly of petrichor and lemon oil, Michelle followed Felicity into the study to look for something Miller had left behind. The room had been rearranged after the trial to give it a lighter air. Softer chairs, fewer papers on display. Felicity opened a bottom drawer she rarely used. Tucked beneath a stack of old manuscripts was a thick envelope, the kind of thing you only notice if you are looking for an afterthought. The handwriting on the front was Miller's, the loops of letters unmistakable for Michelle. They sat on the rug, and Felicity slit the edge with careful fingers. Inside was a single letter in a small, clear-sealed packet. The letter was short, Miller's economy with words intact. If anything happens to me, protect Michelle, it read. She is the legacy I never got to build. Use the funds for her safety and schooling. Trust Felicity. Love, Miller. Beneath the letter, the packet contained a key and a note. Safe deposit box number 412. The key was cold and heavy in Michelle's small palm. Tears came quietly at first, then with a more honest force. Miller had thought, even in the evenings he felt ill, to leave a map for one small life he had liked more than he had known how to admit. Felicity folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. She did not speak for a long minute. When she finally did, her voice was less the strong, clipped sound of the woman who had weathered storms, and more the soft warmth of someone realizing the job she had taken on was no longer a duty but a privilege. They visited the bank on a crisp weekday, moving through the marble lobby like any customers with business and sorrow. The safe deposit box contained documents that made the world more practical, trusts established in Michelle's name, educational funds, instructions for guardianship should Felicity no longer be able to serve. Miller had not left her an empire so much as he had crafted a corner of his world for her safety. It was modest in the context of the billionaire's life, but absolute in its purpose. Provision and protection for the child who had seen too much and yet given the one thing the world sometimes forgets, truth. Months later, the estate settled into a new rhythm. Journalists called less often. The garden was washed and replanted. The portrait of Miller that had dominated the hall was replaced with a smaller, candid photograph of him laughing with Michelle on his knee, an image Felicity insisted on keeping in the foyer so that visitors would see what had been real before they saw the headlines. Michelle returned to school in a nearby neighborhood, where friends learned about her story in fragments and treated her with a mix of curiosity and ordinary childhood cruelty. Felicity defended her gently and taught the rules of small alliances, how to respond to a question about her family, how to hold her head when someone whispered behind her back. Time did not erase what had happened, but it softened jagged edges. Michelle learned to whistle like Miller had taught her, and sometimes, when the house was quiet and the kettle screamed itself into existence, she would stand at the window and hold the pocket watch to the light, watching the faint blue smear that would always stay as a reminder of the night she had chosen to speak. The watch was no longer merely a marker of violence. It had become an emblem of survival and of the responsibility that truth could demand.